Hello, everyone. This is Ernie Humphrey, the CEO of Treasury Webinars. I would like to welcome everyone to our webinar today, M&A from a Treasury perspective, integration risk, opportunities, and pitfalls. I have to give a special welcome to a high school classmate of mine who is a CFO. Hopefully, he will only have good things to share with my classmates at our next reunion. So a topic that is near and dear to my heart. When I was a Treasury manager, I had the opportunity to be involved in acquisition integrations of various sizes from various types of companies. So I'm excited to share my experience, and I'm also excited to have my favorite co-speaker, John Paquette. He's the VP of Solutions in the U.S. for our webinar partner today, TIS. John, welcome to the webinar. Give us a little bit about your background, please.
Thanks, Ernie. Happy to be here again. So as Ernie mentioned, I'm John Paquette, VP Solutions for TIS's U.S. market. I oversee our Solutions Architects team as well as our Customer Onboarding team. I've been with TIS since about 2019, but prior to that, really all my experience was on the practitioner side. I'm working directly within Treasury organizations within the U.S. Worked for a couple companies that were pretty heavy in acquisitions. So, planning for and integrating acquisitions was kind of a common part of my day-to-day. As well as TIS just recently did an acquisition of CashForce, a specialized provider in the cash flow forecasting space. So the topic is fresh in my mind as well. I'm looking forward to the conversation here today.
All right, thanks, John. So before we get started, a few housekeeping items. If you would like a copy of today's presentation, please send an email to ernie@treasurywebinars.com. If you are interested in receiving a certificate of attendance for today's webinar to submit for CPE credits, also please send an email to ernie@treasurywebinars.com. In order to get that certificate of attendance, you're going to have to answer all of our polling questions during the webinar. I appreciate if everyone just takes a second to answer those polling questions, and we'll also have a very short survey at the end of the webinar to help us get better. As we always strive to optimize the ROI we offer you for your valuable time. And we know there's more and more webinars out there, so we appreciate you making the time for our webinar. So a little bit of our roadmap. So we're going to start off at a high level before we dive in. We're going to talk about the Treasury integration roadmap, and then we'll get kind of a little bit about the lay of the land and what's going on in the Treasury space, and then we'll start to dig in on the pathway to that successful integration. We'll talk about building relationships. We'll talk about my favorite soapbox topic, cash visibility and control. Then we'll talk about Treasury policies and control alignment, and then we'll talk about the value in automating manual process aligning system. John will talk to us about how to right-size that technology. We will share an M&A checklist from our friends at AFP. This is not everyone's checklist, but it gives you a really good start for your checklist. And then as we go through that checklist, we'll really wrap things up. What I think are really important that needs a lot of our attention is really we'll talk about the risk exposures that we really need to be paying attention to in today's world, given all that's going on with technology, with ChatGPT, and all the other things going on with AI. And of course, we'll talk about how to capitalize on opportunities for synergies when you make those acquisitions. And John and I will share some of our favorite war stories from our acquisitions. I think I have a few that are fairly entertaining. So before we dive in, just kind of want to level set with our audience here. Just let us know if you're expecting to be involved in that acquisition in the next 3 months, 6 to 9 months, 12, 24 months, you don't see it, or you're involved in one right now. So just interesting information for us as we really start to dive in and really see how relevant, right, this information is going to be for you, especially those of you who are going through that acquisition integration right now. And as John mentioned, he will have some good insights because they have recently gone through the acquisition of CashForce, and I'm sure there may be more on the way. So I'm going to go ahead and leave that polling question up for just a few more seconds for you guys, and then we'll go ahead and let you know, take a quick peek at the results, then we'll really start to dive in. So I'm going to give you guys a few more seconds. Again, those of you who are wearing a certificate of attendance, I need you to answer the polling question. So I'm going to give you a few more seconds. All right, here we go. Close that up. So let's go ahead and take a quick peek. So exciting times, John. Looks like we have 35%, 20% right now, and 15% right, in the next 3 months, and only 26% are not seeing it within the next 2 years. So exciting times that we're seeing with companies, even given some of the economic headwinds. So thank you very much, everyone, for taking the time to answer the polling question. And so let's talk about our journey today, right? For me, it all starts with the lay of the land, right? That due diligence, which is incredibly important. For me, I want to get cash visibility, cash control. Day one, I'll share my cash control story for you. Apologize if you've heard it before. So my company was acquiring another company which was across the country. They were a little bit of a smaller company, and so my CFO would always say, I want you to demonstrate to me that you have control of cash on day one. So I flew out there the night before the acquisition. Once we officially closed, I sent the money, walked into the office, wanted that control of cash. So I found out that they were actually using, this is a little dated, they were using a rubber stamp, right, for someone's signature to write checks. So what did I do before I left? I actually took that stamp, brought it back with me. The CFO calls me up to his office and he says, do you have control of cash? And I whipped out the stamp and I said, yes, I do. Here it is. So we'll talk about that, incredibly important. Of course, along with that, we want to run our policies and controls. And where it makes sense, we want to automate manual process and align on systems. But probably most importantly, we want to capitalize on opportunities for synergies. And what I like to talk about in an acquisition is looking to harmonize processes and systems rather than dictate. And so what I've seen quite often is companies, they make an acquisition for a reason, and then they come in and they want to change everything and start to detract from the value, right, of the acquisition. So John, any of these spots on the road particularly stick out to you when you want to comment on before we dive in?
Yeah, I think for the first one that we're actually going to address here, get the lay of the land, is an important one, right? To really understand all the people, processes, systems that are going to come into play during the acquisition integration, and a lot of those activities are starting so far in advance of when the acquisition actually closes that it's really important to get your arms around those. So glad we're going to spend a little bit of time in the next few slides discussing some of those points.
All right, and then I will hand the floor over to John. He's going to guide us through some of the key areas of due diligence to help us get the lay of the land.
All right, thanks, Ernie. Yeah, when you talk about Treasury mergers and acquisitions integrations, you're integrating some pretty critical processes for the organization. You know, all of your cash visibility processes, payments processes, risk management, foreign exchange processes, stuff that just sort of has to operate as normal on day one once that acquisition actually closes. So I think that's really what we're going to focus on here in the lay of the land, the sort of pre-acquisition due diligence, is what to really focus on from that perspective. And each of the criteria that you see up here on the screen, in order to be fully prepared, fully complete all the planning activities and the pre-work that can be done in the sort of 3 to 6 months preceding the acquisition. Starting here really with Treasury staff at acquisition, and what organizations can do to really prepare themselves for that aspect of the integration. If we move to the next slide here, we have some of the kind of the criteria here for Treasury staff, but mainly it's about understanding who's coming over your team and how they fit into your team. So there could be redundancies in staffs and things like that, and all organizations do some level of right sizing post acquisition. But there can also be some pretty critical people coming over that might be really critical to the success of the acquisition integration. So that's one thing that we always caution, is to don't lose that institutional knowledge. If there are people who are really deeply knowledgeable about the markets, about the particular business lines that the acquiree is interacting with, make sure that those people come over, at least that transfer of knowledge really occurs before any sort of reduction in force or anything like that. And I think the other part of sort of the people aspect of mergers and acquisitions integration is really just the assurance of the people around. Acquisitions tend to make people feel kind of uneasy. But that's really driven by the uncertainty, right? So clear communication can really clear a lot of that up in terms of, both the acquiree, the new staff sort of understanding exactly how they fit into the picture, what their roles are going to be, being introduced to the new staff, but also the current staff could see sort of a threat coming in from new staff members being brought into the organization. And just so they understand as well what their roles are, how their roles might change, and really how they kind of fit into the complete picture. usually you can alleviate a lot of that uncertainty pretty easily. It's silence that seems to do the most harm in these situations when there's no communication really going out in terms of what people should be expecting post-acquisition.
Yeah, John, let me hop in here for a second. So I want to kind of stress this point, and I'd like to get your insights as well. So like when I was going through my first acquisition, I wasn't all that involved in due diligence. And then really I was meeting a lot of the key people after the acquisition. So I didn't know who was who, doing what and why. So I would always ask who I was able to connect with before, right, the acquisition, so I could be ready on day one. So do you have any insights on that? Were you allowed to talk to people before acquisitions closed, or what was your experience there?
Typically we would be able to talk to people on the acquiree side. Mainly think about it, it's hard to even plan for some of these integration activities, these day one activities. You can't speak to the people in charge of the processes or who are managing the bank relationships, who understand the account structure. So it's a critical part of it, I really think. I mean, understanding that companies want to, in some cases, probably limit the amount of people involved, maintain a level of secrecy during the course of these processes, particularly, when you're at the sort of the 6 month in advance versus the few week in advance sort of time frame. But yeah, I think it's a critical part to understand who you can talk to, what you can say, and really leverage those resources on the other side as much as possible for planning purposes. Yeah, and then moving into our next sort of criteria here, the financial systems assessment. So this is another really key one. So obviously the acquiree, the company that you're acquiring, is going to have financial systems of their own. You need to understand what those systems are, how they're fitting into their current day-to-day process, really what's the criticality of those systems to supporting the day-to-day operations of that business. And then, really understand where maybe some redundancies might exist in systems. Commonly Treasury organizations will end up with 2 TMSs, for example, as a result of an acquisition, and then some decisions will need to be made post-acquisition about, what might be the right system to invest in long-term. But I'd say in the near term, really understand what systems are involved, what systems you might need to continue to support you post-acquisition on day one. Commonly, there's a transition services agreement in place where you might have the ability to leverage staff and leverage systems of the previous parent company up to a certain point, say 6 months after acquisition. But then there's sort of an expectation that you're going to have integrated that new entity into your current systems, into your organization's systems, and sort of move off that TSA. So really important to understand those timelines and what processes are involved there, and have a full plan on how they're going to be migrated in. And I'd say also understand, it's easy to pick out redundancies in a very general sense to say, hey, we have a TMS, they have a TMS, we're gonna have to pick one. But it could be that they, have implemented the system differently and are really reliant on it for specific processes for their organization. So they might have, maybe they have more complex risk management or hedging or, in-house bank structures or something like that. And those systems are really, kind of helping to fuel those processes on a day-to-day basis, day-over-day basis. You obviously don't want to just eliminate them because, at a very high level, it seems there's some redundancy in those 2 systems. So, and then probably the other part is you need to understand the systems, because you're going to need data from those systems essentially, right? So when you're creating a forecast holistically on day one across the newly acquired company, you're going to need to know what systems you get certain inputs from, like outstanding AP, outstanding AR, stuff that goes into your cash forecast. You're going to need to understand probably their longer range financial projections and things like that. So really how you extract data from those systems, and maybe even the individuals that you can rely on as sort of the bridge to help you kind of get at the data that you need to support day one processes. That's another probably really key consideration to sort of get squared away prior to that acquisition actually closing. Perfect. So now we're going to talk a little bit about bank relationships and treasury services. And Ernie, I think we're going to hand to you for this slide, if I'm correct.
All right. Thanks, John. I appreciate your insights. Also forgot to mention, we can take your questions in the questions area if you go to webinar control panel. If we don't get to those questions, we'll get with you after the webinar. Tremendous opportunity to tap John's expertise, so please take advantage of that. And so bank relationships and treasury services, I have had some interesting experiences with that, and John, I'm sure, can share a few stories as well. But what you really need to go, obviously, hopefully you know this before you close the acquisition, but you have to figure out which bank relationships do you need to keep, right? And how do you plan to introduce and integrate any new relationships that you might want to keep into your existing bank group? And then probably more importantly, where I learned some hard lessons, is how do you exit relationships gratefully, especially if your bank partner is in some way involved in your payroll services, right? Of course, they're involved in making your payments until you transfer those over. But it's incredibly important. And for myself, an acquisition that we made was a little bit of a smaller company, and there was really just like one bank, right? The bank for the whole town. And that bank was really important to help that business grow. So I knew I needed to be especially careful and graceful and really stay with them really as long as possible and see if there was opportunities to leverage that, because that relationship was built on a lot of trust and there was a lot of integrity there. John, do you have any comments on that bullet point? Seems like this might be something you would hit on.
Yeah, I think we saw this all the time. So, the acquirees bank relationships, I think once they sort of heard that the acquisition was coming, they wanted to sort of proactively be connected with the acquirers, Treasury personnel, to obviously try to protect that relationship. They have a long-standing relationship in most cases with the company that's being acquired. And it's important to really understand that, obviously, right? And what services are going in there, and maybe the complete picture, the complete offering that relationship is, and the value that they're providing to the company that you're acquiring. In some cases, it just doesn't make sense to maintain the bank relationship if it just doesn't fit into your cash management structure, and if there was some debt that the bank had issued that's being retired as part of the acquisition anyway, and the relationship is fundamentally changing. It might not make sense to continue that on just for the sake of keeping good impressions with that banking partner. But in some cases, it does make a lot of sense to add a new banking partner, and you learn about new capabilities that they have that might be better than what your bank has, and how they're supporting specific areas of the business, maybe in a way that's a little bit unique. So definitely dig into those details, take advantage of those conversations with the relationship people to really understand those relationships.
Thanks, John. And also, John touched on the redundancies, but of course, related to that, we really want to see, and of course, we hope to do this before the acquisition closes, right? What are the Treasury services that they are engaged with? Do you need to keep those? Of course, we want to look at those bank analysis statements, which are hard enough for any company, but especially if you are dealing with a company that doesn't have any Treasury staff or one or two Treasury staff, they might not have the time to make sure that all those services are aligned, that they're getting charged for what they need to get charged for. And then we also have to look at, right, which services do you want to convert to your existing partners and system? And so you have to plan that integration. So one thing that was common for me, which was a big pain point, which I'm sure is with every Treasury acquisition, is on the accounts payable front. So normally, at least for a time, you're going to need to keep that bank account open. And then how do you manage that bank account? Do you take over making payments? When do you really look to maybe move away from a certain system? So maybe your bank relationship is with Chase, and maybe they use Fifth Third. So how do you make that adjustment? Do you need to do that adjustment? So John, can you give us a little bit of your context on what you've seen, or maybe some friction, maybe on the AP side or the system side of the Treasury services part?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, people are always a little bit reluctant to change, particularly in an acquisition type situation. The acquiree, have processes in place that they have had established for years and years, so working well for the organization. And I think there's a little bit of a belief that maybe the acquirer doesn't understand those processes all as much as they do. How could they possibly, right? They haven't been sort of in their shoes for years and years and years. So they shouldn't just jump ahead and start changing things without fully understanding that, right? So I think it definitely comes back to the people part, the collaboration for the greater good, the sort of everybody trying to figure out how best to put these processes in place, and the overall sort of interaction between the two companies on that day one. Because I think when it's done in sort of more of a forced way, that's when you start to get a lot of that resistance, right? Where people feel like processes are being changed by people who maybe don't understand them as well as the people who are performing them today.
Yeah, great point. So I just talk about the harmonization part. So I'll just talk about back in the day, we used to have our treasury management. A lot of it was done through, our bank partner. So we had our existing relationship. I was at corporate, worked really well. We acquired a company that was about 25% as big as ours, and they had another partner in our bank group who may have wanted to be the lead bank. So my boss was like, which treasury system should we use, right? So instead of trying to force one or the other, right, for me to change what we've been doing, or vice versa, we wanted to. So I ran these systems side by side. So I got to see it, and luckily the treasurer let me choose. But let me tell you what, the one I had in place was like driving a Cadillac, all the features, and the one that we acquired, even though it was a big bank, was like a Pacer Pinto with a manual transmission. So it was painful to go through that, but it's really important that you make informed decisions, right, about what systems that you're going to use. You want to look at the relationships, but if I would have forced that either way, it would have been extremely painful for all those involved. So this is a topic that we're going to touch on a lot more later, but this is one, especially if you are involved in insurance. Insurance can be incredibly delicate. If your due diligence isn't right, you can get into a lot of things you weren't expecting. So one are the risk exposures you need attention to on day one. Some of those, if you're acquiring a manufacturing facility, things like environmental exposures, things like that, right? And then John mentioned, right, managing those risk exposures, your financial instruments. You may want to look at if they have hedges in place, if they have foreign currencies. And then this is where we had a broker, which was incredibly critical for us. Insurance, do you have gaps in coverage, right, that you're inheriting? What kind of open claims do you have, especially on the workers' comp front? How do you align those with those in place at your companies? How do you get them under your umbrella? And then under insurance, we have captives, and do you need them? And if not, how do you exit? This slide, of course, is a webinar in and of itself. John, just curious, how did you guys do on the insurance front? Did you guys have a broker? How did you manage that part of it?
We did. We had a broker, but I worked in the healthcare industry, and when we did a lot of acquisitions, there was a lot of complex variables to contemplate here. So we had a captive. We had to understand the mechanics of that and how that sort of would change with a newly acquired company coming into our systems, right? So we also participated in a lot of programs, government programs and other programs that required some level of collateralization through like a surety bond or something along those lines, right? Where you're kind of posting some collateral as a condition for participating in that program. And if you're acquiring a company that's in similar programs, you have to then move a lot of those collateral instruments over to the newly acquired company. So there was a lot of work to do there. And to be honest, some of that stuff is amongst the most time consuming and most critical. So you have to make sure you kind of understand those well in advance of the acquisition close date and make sure that everything's sort of lined up. But yeah, we did use an agent for a lot of our insurance capabilities, somebody that we had worked with for years and years and years and had a really good relationship with, could kind of guide us in a lot of these. So no one's an expert on everything. Obviously, definitely use external resources when you can to plug those knowledge.
Absolutely. Yeah, just to dovetail on that, we had such a long relationship with our insurance broker. She would actually go to the board and present with us and actually for us in terms of, the risk assessment of our acquisitions, or explain the risk that exposures we were getting into. So that can be incredibly key. So just the relationships, right, before closing, we've covered a lot of ground here. So obviously we dipped into other categories we're going to talk about just for the nature of the conversation. But again, John and I mentioned key Treasury leaders and staff as allowed. Again, John says, so part of it's just trying to convey that you're not trying to come in and take over. Your first goal should be to listen and understand the why and digest. And then, okay, if we need to change things, make them feel like they're accountable to, if you can at all possible. They have some input in that. We talked about bank relationships, especially key out of the gate, right? The last thing we want to do is acquire a company, right, and not pay our vendors. What about our AR leaders? We don't need to get paid. I will confess I made a mistake on that front. We were converting folks to direct cash to our lockbox, and we had a bank, and there was a different set of wire instructions for ACH versus wires, and I made a mistake, and that went out to all their customers. So let's make sure that we are all aligned on that. risk management, IT leaders, bank relationships, service providers. So just some food for thought. If you're going through this right now, please request the slides, just take a look at this. In addition to giving you actionable advice, we're trying to make you think and ask the right questions. So let's talk a little bit about how do we look at cash visibility. I'll pass the floor back over to John. John?
All right, thanks, Ernie. I think this is one of the most critical topics for Treasury going into an acquisition is just how you're going to get that cash visibility on day one. Obviously, there's only so much you can do in terms of, getting access to the accounts and things before your business actually owns the other business, because legally you don't have a sort of a claim to be able to have access to those accounts. So this commonly consists of those relationships that you're building, trying to figure out who on the other side is, e-banking portal administrator can set people up on your side with access to the e-banking portals to run reports manually, at least on day one, so you can get some sort of visibility into the accounts. And then also thinking about how maybe the credentials are going to change on day one if certain people are losing access or need broader access or whatever it might be, right? So could also be that there are people within the business that are creating daily cash reports today, the one that you're acquiring, and definitely leverage those if you can, any sort of off-the-shelf type reporting that can give you more visibility, because day one for Treasury, cash visibility is control before you can really put in place more sophisticated controls and more formalized processes and things. But then looking at a long term, you definitely have to think about a more automated process for how you're going to get cash visibility more broadly across the newly acquired business. And then you're definitely going to be looking into integrations with your existing Treasury technology tool. Hopefully you have one if you're doing acquisitions. If not, definitely something to consider is that you will need some sort of technology. The more data inputs you have out there to consolidate, the more time it's going to take people to do that manually, obviously, right? So how do you kind of integrate those into the current processes? And that involves talking to the banks, your banks, the newly acquired relationship banks about what they need for legal documentation to formally kind of add those to your feeds that you're getting on a day-over-day basis. But as soon as you kind of have that day one visibility, it's time to start thinking about how to do that in a much more automated way. So in terms of the cash control topic, I mentioned visibility is definitely key control number one. As soon as you have visibility into the business, you can see what's happening on a day-over-day basis. You can monitor transaction activities. You can start learning about the sort of the common practices, the day-to-day of the business. But it's also important to know just sort of what they have in place for current payment approval processes, and really what individuals are involved in that payment approval process, who can input, who can approve, are there different processes at different thresholds, and kind of assess, does that align with your existing organizational processes? Is it at least a close match, or is there material sort of control gaps in that process that will need to be addressed on day one? A lot of businesses, depending on who you're working for, might actually want to take full control of that payment approval process on day one, or at least over certain thresholds, have somebody centrally within the acquirer's Treasury department, handling that from just a control and almost cash visibility standpoint to know what's flowing out of the accounts on a day-over-day basis. Also need to understand who the authorized signers are on those accounts, because it's pretty common post-acquisition for maybe some of the key individuals within the acquired company to ultimately leave. So you want to make sure you have the paperwork teed up in advance to be able to move those signatories over if you need to. Otherwise, it becomes very difficult to collect signatures from certain people, right? So I'd say that's pretty common. I mean, sometimes the acquirer signatories do stay in place. Sometimes, and definitely in my the experience, the account signers usually go over to the acquirer's corporate officer. So there's a lot of signature card updates to make there. And really understand what the bank's going to need for documentation, not just in terms of signature cards and new resolutions, but they'll probably also need a lot of documentation that evidences the acquisition and the change of ownership as well. So really important to dig into those too. Yeah, and then in terms of cash control here, really gotta understand the level of cash control that you can achieve on day one. Like I mentioned before, a lot of times that's sort of limited to some extent to the activity flowing through the e-banking portal. You can at least get visibility, and you can at least get yourself involved in that manual payments processes. And then, but there is some level of due diligence to go through to figure out exactly how to accomplish that, exactly what credentials you need, who can set you up, what controls you want to keep in place, what you want to migrate, and sort of who you want to swap out from a process standpoint on day one. And then more long-term, it makes a lot of sense to start combining those processes together between the two companies. It's, for most companies that have somewhat of a structured treasury department, there's probably a clear approval matrix out there, a cash control matrix, and start thinking about how you can really align that over, all the different areas of payments, which isn't just within treasury, obviously. It's also how your AP payments are being approved within ERP systems, how batch payments are being run and improved, even HR payments or special considerations within HR that fall outside the course of the normal salary procedures on a day-to-day basis might have special approval processes as well. So start thinking about how to bring those two together, understand what the company's doing today, what you guys are doing today, what the gap is, and start working towards a more unified structure. Definitely on day one, if not prior to that.
Yeah, thanks, John. I have a couple of questions. I'm gonna pop in here and I'll attempt to answer those, and I may get your insights as well. So one of the questions is really around there's points of negotiation, right, in the contract, which does not allow the company or the treasury folks access until after the acquisition. On that one, I wish I had advice for you, but the only suggestion is to try and make sure that those negotiating the contract understand the risk in doing that, right? What is the potential cost, right, of not having that in there? What is the control? What are the risks? So again, there's only so much that you can do given your, going back and forth with the lawyers, but the best thing you can do is just communicate, raise your hand and say, I'd really like this to be a point. And with a negotiation, right, it's something they have to decide whether or not it's worth having a battle on, but I'll follow up with this person afterwards. But given what I'm seeing here, I would think this would not be an issue. The other is related, but a little more general. So, John and I are talking about we want to be ready on day one. Well, what happens if the acquisition team was hoarding the data and the content, right, until the deal was closed? So for me, how did I manage that? It happened to me quite often. So really it was okay the first time through it. I got hit with a lot of things. I got hit with a lot of risk exposures. Here's just a few. This company was operating a fireworks business in their plant. They were managing pension assets through an E-Trade account, and the owner had an airplane. So those were just a few things. So once I got that, I kind of had to explain we can't have these risks of what could happen. Fireworks, the plant could blow, burn down, and all those things. You can think about all the other things that I talked about: E-Trade, lawsuits, fiduciary liability, all those good things. So it's really about finessing yourself into that due diligence process, and again, communicating the risk that you're taking on by not being involved, especially like I mentioned on the risk side, on the cash side. John, do you have any comments on how you were able to maybe get more visibility into what you're getting into at all?
Yeah, I mean, I think you never quite know perfectly what you're getting into.
Yeah.
Even with those conversations with people on the other side, it seems like the acquirees staff probably has a tendency to speak positively about their processes, right? Hey, we have a great AP process. We have a great, process for putting together our daily cash reports as on a day-over-day basis. And then when you really get into things post day one, you find out things aren't quite as perfect as you thought they were. But at the end of the day, it was manageable how the business was, kind of controlling those processes pre-acquisition. And although it might not be ideal, you kind of have to somewhat roll with the punches a little bit on some of those items, but just be prepared that the information might not be absolutely perfect. I'd say is probably the best advice you can get. And make sure you have those relationships with the people that control those processes. You can start digging in immediately, or get, if a lot of information is not coming over automatically, it might need to come over through direct conversations with personnel.
Right. And if it's not actually part of the formal due diligence checklist, something I would say would be, okay, I need to know what's going on with AP and AR and cash, and find the person at your company who can ask the questions, maybe to the CFO at the other company, and say, we need to answer these questions. I might not be able to talk to this person directly, but this is what I need to understand. And so, again, you got to explain the risk and the value of doing that. But as John said, you're always going to get a little surprise in your Christmas stocking. That's what kind of makes it exciting. So thank you for your questions. Keep those coming. Again, related to everything, especially risk, right? Our policies and controls, we have to do the lay of the land, right? Do policies exist? Do they align with yours? And then how do you manage the politics of creating alignment? And then we want to be sure that we are communicating, right, the how and why. So these are the reasons for our policies. This is the way that it goes. I'll mention, circle on something John talked about on the accounts payable side. For us, day one was really control of money that goes out the door. So for about 3 months, I had to approve every single invoice of companies, and I said one of them was 25% as large as ours, so I could see directly. I saw they sent us all the paperwork, believe it or not. This is in the day. I had to, so I could understand the payments that they were making. It gave me visibility into things they were doing that we didn't allow, like maybe gym memberships, country club, magazine subscriptions. But that helped me understand what was going on, take control, and then how to integrate their culture into ours. And then obviously, you know, if they don't exist, we want to make sure that those are aligned. So I'm going to go ahead and ask our next polling question here before we let John give us a lot of insight into right sizing technology. So just curious, the technology you have to support Treasury success at your company, right? And hopefully that would help you in an acquisition area. Is it ideal? Is it good? Is it okay? Not good or poor? Don't worry, I'm not going to tell on you if you say poor. Again, those of you interested in receiving a certificate of attendance, please answer the polling question. And of course, we appreciate everyone's consideration and just taking a moment to go ahead and click on that button for us. We sincerely appreciate that. And so I'm going to give you guys a few more seconds. Another reminder, if you'd like a copy of today's presentation, please send an email to Ernie at treasurywebinars.com. So I'm going to go ahead and close the polling question. I'll give you guys a few more seconds, and then I'll pass the floor back over to John, and he will talk about, and he's touched on it some, but he'll dive in a little bit deeper on how to right size that technology post-acquisition. I'm going to go ahead, close the poll. All right, let's go ahead and take a quick peek. Good to see that 41% of you are on your way, right? Ideal and better. And so I guess what we see is not surprising given the rate of technology adoption that we are seeing. So I would say in general, don't settle. There's a lot of companies investing in technology. So for you, part of it is about learning to make that business case, right? And get yourself in those conversations if it's a CFO stack issue. So I guess I'm a little surprised that we don't have a little bit more on the good or ideal side. John, what do you think? What about the conversations you're having? Does this surprise you at all?
To some extent, I think in terms of just in the frame of, you know, an acquisitive company, like, yeah, I think most companies out there have pretty good treasury software for like foundational cash management needs. But maybe one thing to recognize is if your company is doing a lot of acquisitions, those technology changes, those technologies might be changing a little bit in terms of what you need to support those processes. So different businesses, different geographies, or just in general, I never see companies just do one acquisition and be totally satisfied with that. It seems like doing one, they're in an acquisitive mode, and there's going to be more to come. And so it's, you know, it's good to think about how to put in place a technology structure that's going to be scalable. It's going to support that additional acquisition integrations as you go. I think specifically in the areas that we've been discussing around cash management, cash visibility, and, you know, payments controls and things like that. So I think those are the key takeaways.
Just kind of popped in my mind, which is every so often something pops in there that's valuable. So the acquisition is a business case to upgrade your technology, right? Technology should support your growth. When technology hinders your business practices, that's when you have a problem. So a lot of times with acquisitions, you're going into different areas. You have different needs. Maybe you have all these new risk exposures. You might need some sort of technology to support that. Maybe you're doing more international payments. Maybe your counterparty risk is changing. So in that acquisition mode is where we want to be. Now, what happens if you have weaknesses in your technology and AP and AR and your core treasury functions, guess what happens if you make an acquisition? They're going to get magnified, kind of similar to what we saw with COVID, right? If there were cracks in your foundation, they are going to be exposed and things can really fall apart if you're trying to do an acquisition and manage all those things on top of what your technology is kind of stretched to begin with. So John, back to you a little bit more on technology right sizing to kind of continue on that point maybe.
Yeah, sure. So I think we touched about this one a little bit too, in terms of, what the priorities are.
All right, John, I think we lost you for a second. Can someone comment in there? Can you guys still hear John? I've kind of lost the sound there. All right, John, I think we lost your sound a little bit. So I'm going to go ahead and jump back in here, John, and then you can jump back in once we get your sound. So really, what John was talking about was, how do we right size the technology? How do we realize where are we at and where do we need to be given the acquisition, but also our future strategy is involved. So do we need to buy systems or upgrade the new system with the acquired company? Are we going to be able to integrate those? Do we even have the right environment, right? Do we have a cloud environment? But also it's interesting in terms of upgrading technology. A lot of times what I had seen way back when we had ERP systems were first coming out, a lot of big companies would make an acquisition and try a cloud ERP system and compare that with your on-premise. And a lot of times what they find was that cloud ERP environment was better. And so that acquisition also gives you the opportunity. And so again, it gives you the opportunity to really harmonize on your systems. And so again, it's actually the opportunity. Just think of it as maybe it's this, okay, we want to try a new T&E expense management. Our company's huge. Maybe we have an acquisition. We can beta test that. And again, that's harmonizing that technology. And so I think that is the right part of it. And you may acquire a company that has better technology in AR. Again, it already exists. Company of that acquisition. So talk about capitalizing on those opportunities for synergies. So John and I touched on many of these points. So opportunities for synergies, we want to look at people. So just in general, let me share a survey that I've seen in terms of people. Companies, regardless of acquisitions, company size, people are investing in staff. They're not only investing in Treasury staff, they're investing in AP staff, AR staff. They're also investing in professional development opportunities as well. So these are things that you should expect, things that you should almost demand, but you also need to think about these things. Maybe you need someone who is versed in different areas with your skill, right? With different skill sets, maybe you have a different skill set, when you're integrating that company into yours. So do you want to train someone up? Do you want someone from the acquired company? John and I talked about these process technology. We like to keep it simple, right? That's part of my skill set. So think of it, people, process, technology. Now let's go ahead and hop into this. I'm not going to read through all this, but AFP did a really good job back in the day, a lot of investing in the checklist. Again, these are things that you're going to have to do yourself. I will say that for myself and my company, the checklist was never the same. I would say you need a pre-integration checklist and also that post checklist as well. And so, some of these areas that you want to look at, right, you need to adjust those. So don't try and cram your template on an acquisition that you might actually not need that. So just note that before we get started. This is a really comprehensive list. So I would say this is something to look good, right? And then pare down on. And again, this is from 2017 from our friends at AFP. John and I talked about a lot of these things, but it's just getting into the details, bank relationships and accounts. Okay, We talked about what does that mean? Debt. What kind of debt are we inheriting? Like John said, maybe we can retire that. What kind of investments do we have? Extremely important on the risk management front, right? Do they have investments that do not align with your investment policy? For me, yes, I saw that a lot. What about FX, the commodities? Do they have, John Leonard mentioned letters of credit, guarantees? What about their benefit plans? If you have not had the joy of integrating a 401k plan, I will tell you it is fun. I'm just kidding. And pension plans. So that can be an incredibly taxing area, but you need to understand what you're getting into. It's not quite as common, but if someone has a pension plan, there's liabilities that go with that. So you need to make sure you know what you're getting into. Again, I didn't find out post-acquisition one time that they had pension assets in a E-Trade account. So that obviously was not a good idea. We talked about insurance. We talked about operations and process. So again, a lot of detail here. Again, if you'd like a copy of the slides, please let me know. I'd like to give you more than you need so you can really dive deep where you need to. We talked about the bank accounts, right? Purpose for accounts, bank accounts, it's important we build that trust, right? Why we need them. We talked about the bank analysis statements. Make the point again, signatures, signers. When I was back in the day, we had folks that were signers on our account who were deceased. So that's, I guess, not funny for the four people that were deceased, but those are the things that you might walk into. Those of you with foreign bank accounts, your FBAR reporting, your compliance status, going back to your pension, look at your filings on your pension statements, who are the providers. If you have 401k, if you want to convert folks into your plan, you have to have a blackout period. So that's a whole other webinar. That was actually my first presentation at AFP, integrating payment plans. We have debt, we talked about that. We already talked about all these good things. Of course, incredibly important on your exhibits, your covenants, and your notices required there. So that's good. So I think we have John back. John, did you have anything you wanted to add on the right sizing of technology that I missed for us?
Yeah, I'm not sure how much you covered on that slide as I dropped out, and apologies for dropping out there.
Yeah.
I seem to have some sort of power surge that wiped out my Wi-Fi momentarily there. But yeah, technology, I think we covered a lot of it in terms of, I think step one is figuring out what technology is in use for the business today and what might be going away as some sort of part of some sort of transition services agreement where you might have just sort of a temporary access to these systems and you have to migrate them to new systems within a certain amount of time. And then it becomes sort of evaluating those redundancies in the long-term plans. I think you hit a really good point, like right before I dropped out around, what you're walking into for systems in place today. We had instances where we acquired companies that had TMSs and they were in process of sort of being forced into an upgrade by the providers. And we had to make quick decisions in terms of, hey, are we going to do this upgrade? Are we going to move off this system? So those might be some of the challenges that you're facing today in terms of like just sort of inheriting some of this legacy technology as part of these acquisitions. So keep an eye out for those types of situations. If you can understand those technology contracts before, especially those that pertain to Treasury, definitely try to dig into that during the due diligence process.
Yeah.
And then it's the long-term plan. And I touched on this briefly during the survey results, but I think it's also just the overall technology plan and really making sure that the technology you have in place suits how the business is changing. So like I said before, companies that do acquisition usually do them in bunches. So usually you have one, but then you have more coming up quickly. And a lot of the companies that we're talking to that are highly acquisitive, they sort of end up in a really tough place where they have this very fragmented data. They're trying to do forecasting, but that's from 8 different systems. They've all been, sort of come on board during the course of acquisitions. Likewise, they're trying to implement controls around their payment processes, but they can't because the payments being initiated from so many different sources. They have just a bank portfolio that's growing and growing with every single acquisition. And so really their technology need is more so finding something to aggregate, simplify, consolidate all this data, sort of being the unifier of these processes, both for the recently acquired entities, but also to support any new acquisitions coming up in the future. So definitely something to think about. Don't just think about the current state of technology, but think about where the company is going and where might be the right areas to invest. So I think those were really the key points I was going to make on this slide.
All right, thanks, John. Glad to have you back. So let's touch on a couple of things. We talked about investments. right? Very important. Your short-term investments, maybe have long-term investments, aligning that with your policy, right? I talked about your statements, FASB, your ISAB reporting, all that good stuff, so you don't get caught off guard, your hedging policy, your netting arrangements. Again, what kind of exposures, how are they looking at their exposures? Are they capturing them? Are they hedging them? Do they have natural hedging opportunities? And then your accounting considerations for each hedging transaction. You might get into that there. And then we talked about benefit plans. Again, this is really relevant depending on your role in Treasury's role. This is all about risk that we can really inherit. A lot of times Treasury is the workforce for the benefit committee, which is what my treasurer was at my company, the trust statements, the loan documents, the audits, the asset liability studies. And then we talked about insurance, very important, open claims, tails, captives. Sorry, I'm not a captive fan. It's really hard to get out of a captive. They can make sense, but especially in an acquisition, you can inherit things that are really dicey. And John talked about 30 bonds outstanding related to the policies that you have open. And then, so this is where we have a lot of different exposures. So we kind of glossed over risk exposures, but this is incredibly important in today's world. We talk about, and I'll wrap through these and then I'll bring you in, John, for specific areas, but payments risk, right? The different kinds of payments. Now we have counterparty risk. Now we have something called Silicon Valley Bank, social media risk exposures, right? I should put in here chat GPT exposures. I'm going to have a webinar on that. Where's our data going? Is it secured? We have cyber risk, right? We have policy non-compliance with the policies we have. We have employee disengagement risk, right? Losing people, and then the retention risk of that institutional knowledge at the acquired company. So, John, why don't you hit a couple of those for us? I know you want to hit payments risk, but maybe pick payments in another area and give us a little bit of your insight and experience on what people really need to be looking for.
Yeah, payments risk. I think you have to keep an eye on how the payments processes are going to change based on how the newly acquired company is operating. I'll give you an example. So, we were talking to a company that, US-based company that was acquiring a company based in Latin America as part of their business. And it turns out that Latin American company was making payments into Cuba, which was allowed based on the that they were operating in. But once they became part of the larger US business, there are obviously sanctions risks and things like that that come into play. So in this kind of blindsided them quite a bit. They were talking to us about some sanction screening solutions and things like that. So you don't know how your payments processes are going to evolve when you acquire a company and what types of new payments you're going to be making. So there are definitely a lot of risks there. I think just in general, acquisitions, there's a lot of disorganization initially in terms of who's approving payments and things like that. And it's a ripe environment for fraud risk, things like business email compromise attempts or like fake invoice schemes and things like that. So a lot of times it's a good idea to have something in place that really backstops those payment processes until you really permanently, but definitely while you have that period of uncertainty where there's a lot of sort of confusion around continuity of payment processes. So yeah, like you mentioned, I picked that one. The other one I would definitely pick is the employee disengagement risks is real. I think during the course of an acquisition, it's even if people do come over and join the new team at the newly acquired company, you never know how that's going to take. You never know if people are going to be satisfied with their positions, if their work culture, their work life is the same as it was at their previous organization, or if they might ultimately end up looking for new opportunities. So I think anybody within Treasury who's ever staffed up a department before knows how much work it is to recruit, to interview, to hire, to onboard somebody, right? So it's really important to keep an eye on those disengagement risks, make sure people are kind of acclimating and integrating in the team correctly, so you don't have suddenly a lot of new employees, really key people leaving the organization as a result of the acquisition.
All right, great, thanks, John. So let me add a little color here from my experience. Payments risk for me, what I saw, which I know is still prevalent, when we took over companies, we had to leave their AP account open, right, for a period, and as those checks were running down, there was always check fraud. We had positive pay in place, so it's really important if you make an acquisition to make sure that there's controls around that positive pay, payee positive pay as well, but also you need to make sure that if you're implementing a new service at a company and maybe they're involved, make sure they understand the importance of it. I had positive pay in place and someone was supposed to review it and they just clicked OK without reviewing it. So that's a fraud risk. So I would say that. Counterparty risk exposures, I know that's more important, but again, you need to know what you are getting into there. And then the social media piece is incredibly important. Just make sure that that's on the radar. You might see that as under Treasury, but I think that's something that we need to be looking at. The reason it falls here is because people that are involved in payments, approving payments, whatever that might be, the people will go after them on social media. So we need to make sure that they are educated. John did a great job on this. Employee disengagement, retention risk. There are certain people at that company you need. And the other thing, which is a risk exposure, is not having a direct line of communication. So we always had someone that was at the acquired company for 2 weeks, a month, 3 months. So they were the conduit, right, for that communication if it needed to happen, someone that was trusted by both sides. I played that role. And then once we acquired a company, even 6 years later, 7 years later, any question about that acquired company, what happened, why, they were still coming back to me because I was that person. Make sure that you have that person embedded. Make the investment. Let them be on the ground to build those relationships face to face. That is incredibly important. I'm going to go ahead and launch our final polling question here as I go through our closing comments. Everyone, I appreciate your consideration in answering that polling question. Consideration not only of myself, but also for our webinar partner. I think I got so excited. I don't even know if I thank my webinar partner today, TIS. I want to make sure everyone knows they have a strong commitment to thought leadership. They have great resources on their website. They have a commitment to your success, those who use their products. So I think that's very evident in all that you'll see. And so some of the key takeaways I want to hit on real quick, really just something to think about. Prepare, 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 right? Stick your nose in wherever you can. Make sure that your voice is heard. Make sure people understand what information you need, why you need it. Do not burn bridges. John did a great job of really explaining why you shouldn't do that. Right? Build relationships at the acquired company, ensure consistency in policies and culture, but also take advantage of opportunities. Again, let's look at people, process, and technology post-acquisition. So let's take a look at making it better. How do we and risk? I'm going to and leave the polling question up. I want to make sure I give you a warning. I'm going to go ahead and close that. So please just give me a second. Click on that. I really appreciate it. All right. Thank you so much. Before we wrap things up, I want to let everyone know I'm excited. I have recently announced I am doing a cash management tech demo days on September 14th. The registration is open. I'm going to feature tech demos, which I've never done before, from 9 solutions, 3 in AP, 3 in AR, and 3 in Treasury, to help everyone stay on top. Everything is changing so quickly out there. I want to give people a cost-effective way to look at those solutions. So in closing, John, I want to thank you for joining us. I appreciate your insights. It's always a pleasure to speak with you, John. So thank you, John.
Yeah, thank you, Ernie, as well. Always good to be on your webinars.
And also, again, I want to thank TIS for their commitment to thought leadership. Those of you who might be going to Texpo, John and I will both be there next week, so we would love to meet you in person. Finally, I appreciate each and every one of you. Make the rest of your day great, everyone.